This was the only house built for what was coming.
There are some things a person carries without knowing they are carrying them. Velma Hollis had been carrying the weight of an unfinished promise for 14 months when she finally stopped the car, turned off the engine, and sat in the silence of a Tuesday morning, looking at a piece of land that was nothing more than tall grass, a leaning fence post, and a view of the Carolina sky stretching wide and gray toward the coast. She had driven to Lot 42 4 times since the funeral. 3 times she had sat in the same spot engine idling and then backed out onto the road and driven home without stepping out of the car. She was not afraid of the land. She was afraid of what stepping onto it would mean. It would mean she had made a decision, and making that decision meant admitting that Barnett was not coming back to make it with her. On the 4th visit, she turned off the engine. She reached across the passenger seat and picked up the notebook. It was a composition book, the old kind with the black and white marbled cover, the kind Barnett had bought by the dozen from an office supply store in Atlanta every year since 1987. He had filled hundreds of them over the course of his career. Most of them were stored in labeled banker boxes in the garage, organized by year and project, the way an engineer organizes everything, with a system that made sense to him and bewildered everyone else. But this one she had found in the bottom drawer of his desk, not in a labeled box. It had been sitting under a road atlas and a folded blueprint of a bridge project from 2003, as if it had been put away in a different kind of place. Not archived, hidden, or perhaps set aside waiting for the right person to open it. She had found it 2 days after the funeral when she was cleaning his desk because she needed something to do with her hands. She had opened it not knowing what she expected to find. What she found instead had made her sit down on the floor of his study and stay there for a very long time. She opened it now to the page she had read so many times that the paper had softened along the crease. Near the top, in Barnett's careful engineer's handwriting, the kind that printed every letter as if the letter itself mattered, were 4 lines, a set of coordinates, a compass bearing, and below those 2 sentences. Elevation sufficient, northwest exposure correct. This ground will hold. Below those sentences, written in a different ink, darker, pressed harder into the page as if written with more urgency, were 5 words. Vel will know what to do. She closed the notebook and looked out at the tall grass bending in the coastal wind. Barnett Wyndham had been an engineer for 35 years. He had designed load-bearing systems for federal highway overpasses, flood control infrastructure for 3 different river systems, and blast-resistant tunnel linings for 2 Department of Defense projects she was never fully briefed on. He was not a man who wrote things down without a reason. He was not a man who left notes. He left calculations. He left specifications. He left margin annotations so precise that junior engineers had photocopied his project files to study the way he thought. He did not leave her a note that said, "I love you," in a place where she would find it after he was gone. What he left her was a set of coordinates and a construction notebook with 47 pages of structural calculations for a type of building most people had never heard of. She understood in the way that a person who has been married to someone for 39 years understands things without being told that this was his version of the same thing. She stepped out of the car. Whispering Pines Estates had been developed 4 years earlier on a stretch of coastal North Carolina land that a developer named Arden Pendleton had purchased from a family farm operation that could no longer sustain itself. Arden had a gift for identifying land that looked like nothing and transforming it into something that appealed to a very particular kind of buyer. He liked clean lines, he liked uniformity, he liked the way that a neighborhood of large, well-matched houses on manicured lots communicated a certain kind of status to anyone driving through it. He had built 3 such communities in the previous decade, and he understood his market precisely. Whispering Pines was his best work. The lots were generous, the roads were smooth and winding in a way that suggested natural elegance rather than a grid, and the covenants were strict enough to ensure that every home in the development told roughly the same story. Pitched roofs, traditional facades, a minimum of 3,000 square feet, no outbuildings visible from the street. The Homeowners Association, chaired by a woman named Hesper Langford, whose husband was a real estate attorney, enforced those covenants with a thoroughness that the residents had come to expect and mostly appreciated. Arden himself lived directly across from Lot 42. His house was 6,000 square feet of timber frame construction with an expansive glass conservatory along the back, a wraparound deck he had finished installing the previous spring, and a roofline designed by a Raleigh architectural firm called Apex that specialized in the kind of visually complex structures that photographed well for luxury real estate listings. He had paid a great deal of money for that roofline. He considered it one of the better investments of his professional life. When Velma Hollis submitted architectural plans to the Oak Haven County Zoning Board for construction on Lot 42, Arden was in his truck 2 blocks away, picking up his dry cleaning, when his phone rang. It was Hesper. She described what she had seen in the filing in a tone of controlled alarm that Arden recognized as the voice she used when she thought something was about to threaten property values. He pulled over and listened. The plans called for a monolithic dome, a single continuous shell of reinforced concrete formed over an inflatable airform, tapering from a foot thick at the foundation to 8 inches at the apex, coated in polyurethane foam for insulation and moisture resistance, fitted with recessed polycarbonate windows and a single marine-grade steel entry door. The footprint was 2,500 square feet. The height at the center was 22 feet. From the exterior, it would look like a large, smooth hill had grown on the corner lot of one of the most carefully curated neighborhoods in Oak Haven County. Arden did not finish picking up his dry cleaning. He had done his research before he appeared at Velma Hollis's temporary apartment in town 4 days later. He knew she was a retired aerospace engineer, 35 years, with a defense contractor that had worked primarily on structural analysis for airborne systems. He knew her husband had died 14 months ago. He knew she had no children. He knew she had purchased Lot 42 in cash. He knocked on her door at 10 in the morning, carrying a manila envelope. When she opened it, he took a moment to assess her. She was a small woman, compact and deliberate in the way she stood, with gray hair, cut short, and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked at him with the focused patience of someone who had been expecting a visit and was curious to see how it would go. He introduced himself, and she invited him in without particular warmth or hostility. He sat across from her at a kitchen table that held a coffee mug, a legal pad, and the black and white composition notebook. He placed the manila envelope on the table and slid it toward her. Inside was a cashier's check. The amount was 140% of what she had paid for the lot. She looked at the check without picking it up. He explained his position carefully, the way he had rehearsed it: the aesthetic guidelines of the community, the impact on neighboring property values, the disruption to the visual coherence that made Whispering Pines what it was. He kept his voice neutral and his posture relaxed. He told her he understood she had recently experienced a significant personal loss and that his offer was genuine. She could take the money, find a different piece of land, perhaps somewhere more rural where a building of that nature would be appropriate, and everyone would come away from the situation well. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at the check for another moment. Then she pushed the envelope back across the table to him. "You drove 2 hours from Raleigh to bring me this," she said. He confirmed that he had. She said that told her he was more worried than he was letting on. He started to respond, and she added without raising her voice that if the zoning board had any actual grounds to deny her a permit, he would have started there instead of here. The fact that he was sitting in her kitchen with a cashier's check meant he already knew the permit was going to be approved. Arden had been in real estate development for 22 years. He was not accustomed to people reading his hand that cleanly. He kept his expression even, but something shifted in the room. He picked up the envelope and stood. He told her he hoped she would reconsider. She told him she appreciated the visit. He filed the lawsuit through the HOA 9 days later. The legal action named Velma Hollis as a defendant on grounds of violating the aesthetic covenants of Whispering Pines Estates. The HOA retained the firm of Bowers Lynch and Covington for the litigation. They also retained a structural and zoning consultant to provide technical testimony regarding the proposed construction. That consultant's name was Clifton Carmichael. Velma found that out on a Thursday evening when she sat down at her kitchen table with the filing documents her attorney had dropped off. She was most of the way through the packet, reading carefully, as she always read technical documents before she reached the page with the consultant's credentials and biography. She read the name once, then again. Clifton Carmichael, licensed structural engineer, state of North Carolina. Principal, Carmichael Engineering Group, Raleigh. Faculty affiliate, Georgia Tech Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, 1988 through 2001. She set the packet down and looked at the wall. Barnett had started at Georgia Tech in the fall of 1977. Clifton Carmichael had been a graduate student and junior instructor at the time. Barnett had mentioned him perhaps a dozen times over the course of their marriage, always in the context of formative things, the way people mention the teachers who permanently altered the way they think. He called Clifton the first person who had ever explained structural failure to him in a way that made the physics feel personal rather than abstract. He said Clifton had a gift for making engineering feel like it mattered. Clifton was several years ahead of Barnett. By the time Barnett completed his undergraduate degree, they had overlapped for 2 years. According to everything Barnett had told her, they had stayed loosely in touch for a decade after graduation, and then lost contact the way people lose contact before the internet made staying in touch effortless. Barnett had never mentioned Clifton as someone he thought about with regret. He had mentioned him the way a person mentions a teacher who shaped them long ago, with a kind of warm and settled gratitude. Velma looked at the composition notebook sitting on the corner of the table. She pulled the packet back toward her and kept reading. The 8 months that followed were by any reasonable measure the most legally and socially unpleasant period of Velma Hollis's adult life. The HOA case moved through the court system with the grinding persistence of well-funded litigation. Hesper Langford organized 2 community meetings that she described in the neighborhood newsletter as town halls regarding development standards, which were in practice organized efforts to build social pressure against the project. She circulated a petition. She wrote to the County Planning Commission. She arranged for an architect from Apex to attend one of the meetings and speak about the impact of aesthetic nonconformity on residential property values. A presentation that drew enthusiastic applause from about 20 homeowners and careful silence from Silas Pruitt, who was sitting in the back row with a can of soda and the expression of a man trying to figure out what he actually thought. Silas Pruitt had lived in Whispering Pines for 3 years, renting the smallest house in the development from an owner who had moved to Florida. He was 41 years old and had been doing residential roofing work on the North Carolina coast since he was 19. He had put hurricane straps on houses from Wilmington to the Outer Banks. He had worked through 4 major storms and re-roofed 47 homes in the aftermath of the worst of them. He knew the coast the way a person knows something they have worked in with their body for 2 decades. He was not invited to sign Hesper's petition because Hesper had assessed him as a renter without standing in the property values conversation. He signed it anyway when she left a copy in the community mailbox area because he genuinely was not sure the dome was a good idea. But he did not feel as certain about his uncertainty as most of his neighbors seemed to feel about theirs. About 6 weeks into the legal proceedings, he drove past the lot and saw Velma standing outside talking to the foreman from the concrete company she had hired, the kind of company that normally built bridge supports and retaining walls rather than residential homes. He pulled over. He introduced himself and said he had a question, not a complaint. She said she would try to answer it. He said he had spent 20 years putting roofs on coastal homes, and the current building codes for hurricane resistance had been developed and tested through decades of real-world storms. He understood she was an engineer. He was not questioning her credentials, but he wanted to know why she believed the existing standards were insufficient. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said because the existing standards were calibrated against the storms of the last century, and the water temperatures feeding Atlantic storms have increased by 3 degrees above historical averages over the past 20 years. And that difference is not linear. It is exponential. The storms that those standards were designed to resist are not the storms that are coming. He stood with that for a second. Then he said he had never had a roof blow off. She said he had never had a big enough storm. He thought about that for a while after he drove away. He could not decide if she was right, but he also could not find a place in his experience where she was clearly wrong. The pivotal hearing in the HOA lawsuit came in the 5th month of the case. Clifton Carmichael appeared in the courtroom in a gray suit with a leather portfolio and the posture of a man who had done expert testimony before and found it neither pleasant nor difficult. He was 70 years old with the careful stillness of someone who chose his words the way an engineer chose materials for load-bearing capacity rather than decoration. He presented his technical assessment in a measured voice. His conclusion was that the proposed structure deviated from regional construction norms in ways that raised questions about emergency egress standards and long-term maintenance compatibility with the surrounding infrastructure. Velma sat at the table on the other side of the room and listened to every word. When it was her turn to respond, she opened her folder and placed a document on the table. Then she slid it to the center so that it was visible to both the judge and to Clifton. It was 12 pages of structural load calculations. The margins were dense with annotations. Two sets of handwriting ran through it, one tighter and more vertical, one looser, with a slight leftward lean. Both sets of handwriting had signed the cover page. Velma Hollis, Barnett Wyndham. She looked at Clifton and asked if he recognized the handwriting. The courtroom was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Clifton Carmichael looked at the document. He looked at the two signatures. He looked at the annotations in the margins, the looser handwriting, the slight leftward lean for a moment that was long enough to tell everyone in the room that yes, he recognized it. Then he looked away. He did not answer her question directly. The judge moved the proceedings forward, but the moment had already done its work. Velma won the case 3 weeks later. The judge found that the HOA's aesthetic guidelines as written were not legally enforceable against state-level safety and construction codes that specifically encouraged storm-resistant building techniques. Construction could proceed. The afternoon after the ruling, Velma stayed in the courtroom while her attorney gathered his files and the other parties filed out. She was reading the decision document when she heard footsteps stop near the door. She did not look up immediately. When she did, Clifton Carmichael was standing at the threshold with his portfolio under his arm and his hat in his hand looking at the floor. He did not turn around. He said quietly that Barnett was the most naturally gifted structural thinker he had ever worked with, that he had known it from the first week Barnett sat in his section, that there were students who learned engineering and students who understood it, and Barnett had been the second kind from the beginning. Then he walked out. Velma sat alone in the empty courtroom. The decision document was still in her hands. She was not reading it anymore. She was looking at the door Clifton had walked through, and she was thinking about a Tuesday evening in 1984 when Barnett had come home from a project review meeting with muddy boots and a look on his face that meant something had gone well. And she had asked what happened, and he had said Clifton finally signed off on the cantilever, and she had handed him a beer without fully understanding what that meant. And he had smiled at her like she had given him exactly what he needed. She did not cry at the funeral. She had stood at the gravesite in November with her coat buttoned and her hands folded, and she had kept herself together the way she had kept herself together through every hard thing in her life, which was by focusing on the next thing that needed to be done. The burial, the reception, the thank you notes, the garage, the desk, the notebook. She cried in the empty courtroom alone for the first time since he died. Construction began the following week. The mockery from the neighborhood was a predictable backdrop to the months of building the kind of sustained social hostility that takes the form of pointed conversations just loud enough to be overheard in social media posts that do not name names but leave no doubt about their subject. Arden stood on his new wraparound deck on a Saturday in April and raised his glass toward the construction site across the street and made a comment about a bomb shelter that got 12 laughs from the neighbors gathered around his outdoor grill. Hesper Langford jogged past the site every morning for 6 months in expensive athletic clothing and never once looked directly at the workers. She simply jogged past with her chin up and her eyes forward, which was its own kind of statement. One morning, Velma came outside to find that the row of low coastal shrubs she had planted along the front of the lot, chosen specifically from USD recommendations for storm-resistant native landscaping, had been pulled out overnight and replaced with 6 large ornamental palms. No note, no explanation, just 6 palms standing in the morning light, their fronds moving in the coastal breeze, looking exactly like the kind of thing the rest of Whispering Pines considered attractive. Velma looked at the palms for a long time. Then she called a landscaping company and had them removed and the original shrubs replanted. She did not file a police report. She did not send a letter to the HOA. She had too many other things to do. The construction proceeded through the summer and into the fall. The airform was inflated, the foam was sprayed, the rebar grid was set, the shotcrete was applied in thousands of pounds of pressurized concrete that gradually became the curved shell of the building Barnett had designed. Silas Pruitt drove past the site often enough that he eventually stopped pretending he was passing by for other reasons and just parked and watched for 20 minutes at a time. The way a person watches something that raises questions they have not finished answering. Once in October, he and Velma stood outside together while the exterior coating was being applied. He asked her if the polyurethane really provided enough thermal mass for a coastal application. She explained the layering system, the way the foam bonded to the concrete, the moisture resistance, rating the insulation value. He listened carefully and asked two follow-up questions that told her he understood what she was saying. Then he said he still thought a properly installed hip roof with modern hurricane straps could handle anything short of a direct hit from a major storm. She said, "You have never had a direct hit from a major storm." He said, "Not yet." They looked at each other. There was something almost collegial in it. Two people who took building seriously arguing about the best way to build. She respected his experience. He respected, even if he had not yet admitted it, that her reasoning was coherent. They simply disagreed about the probability of the thing she was preparing for. The night the last exterior coating was finished, Velma let the workers go early and walked through the completed shell alone. It was still raw inside, no drywall, no fixtures, just the curved concrete walls and the smooth curve of the ceiling arching up to the apex 22 feet above her. The polycarbonate windows were installed. The steel door was sealed. The building smelled of concrete and foam and the particular mineral cleanness of new construction. She sat down on the floor in the center of the empty space and opened the notebook to the last page Barnett had written on. The sentence was there, the one she had read so many times she could have recited it without looking. "When the storm passes, what remains is real ground." She did not know when he had written it. She did not know if he had written it about this project or about something else entirely, or about nothing specific, the way a person sometimes writes a sentence because the sentence feels true rather than because it describes a particular thing. She had turned it over in her mind for 14 months trying to decide what he meant, and she had come to believe that this was one of those questions Barnett had left her intentionally without an answer, the way he occasionally did when he wanted her to work something out herself. She sat in the empty dome with the notebook open on her knees and listened to the coastal wind moving over the curved exterior. Inside, there was no whistle, no groan. The wind passed over the surface and continued on its way, and inside the shell, there was only the particular quiet of a space that had been designed to resist. She thought about the 5 words at the bottom of the page with the coordinates. Vel will know what to do. She thought about all the things she still was not sure she knew. She thought about whether she was building this house because it was the right house to build, or because completing it was the only way she had found to keep moving forward. Since the November afternoon they had driven home from the oncologist's office, and Barnett had reached across the center console and taken her hand without saying anything, and they had sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before either of them could figure out what came next. She thought about the question she had been avoiding since the courtroom. When the house was finished, when there was no more building left to do, what then? She did not have an answer. She closed the notebook and sat in the silence for a while longer. Then she got up, turned off the work light, and locked the steel door behind her. 2 years passed, the way time passes when a person is living inside work rather than alongside it. The house was finished. She moved in during a wet March that made the coastal roads slick and kept most of her neighbors indoors, where they could not observe the moving truck parked in front of the dome without an easy excuse to comment on it. She planted the low shrub garden she had reestablished after the palm incident. She installed a solar array flush against the south-facing curve of the exterior, bolted directly to the concrete. She set up her weather monitoring equipment in the small office off the main living room. The barometric sensors and ocean temperature feeds and the atmospheric modeling software she had been running informally since the year Barnett circled the North Atlantic water temperature charts in red pencil and said something quiet about what he thought the next 20 years of storm activity might look like. The neighbors adapted to the existence of the dome the way people adapt to things they cannot change, through a process of graduated indifference that still contained at its edges a persistent contempt. Arden's deck parties continued. Hesper's HOA newsletters continued to describe the community aesthetic in terms that made clear what kinds of structures were considered acceptable within it and what kinds were not. Opaline Pendleton, Arden and his wife, occasionally stood at the kitchen window of their house across the street and watched the dome in the mornings when the light hit its curved surface and turned it a pale, warm gray. She did not think the building was ugly. She had thought so at first when Arden first described it to her in the outraged terms of a man whose landscaping investment was being threatened. But looking at it in the morning light, she found it had a quality she did not have a word for. It looked settled. It looked like something that had decided to be exactly where it was. She had never spoken to Velma Hollis directly. She thought about it sometimes. In late August, 2 years after Velma had moved in, the National Hurricane Center began tracking a tropical disturbance forming off the coast of West Africa. They named it Cillian. The initial models showed a familiar arc, the kind of northeastern curve that returned most Atlantic storms safely to open ocean before they reached the eastern seaboard. The forecast graphics looked reassuring. Arden posted them on the neighborhood page with a comment about the news always finding something to worry about. Velma was not watching the forecast graphics. She was watching the ocean surface temperature data for the deep water region south of the Bahamas, which had been running 3 degrees above the historical August average since the first week of the month. She was watching the atmospheric pressure ridge building to the north of Cillian's projected path, the kind of high-pressure system that could block a storm's natural northeastern recurvature, the way a dam blocks a river. She was watching the jet stream position, which was displaced further north than it should have been for the time of year. She sat at her monitoring station on a Tuesday evening with Barnett's notebook open beside the keyboard. She turned to the page where he had written in the cramped notational style he used when he was thinking through a problem, a set of observations about Atlantic storm behavior that he had compiled from publicly available research during the last 2 winters of his life. At the bottom of the page, underlined twice, were the words, 3-degree threshold. If sustained through September, do not stay near the coast. Below that, in the darker ink written later, Vel will know what to do. She looked at the data on her screen. Then she looked at the sentence. She reached over and began the sequence she had been rehearsing in her mind for 2 years. She checked the seals on the polycarbonate windows. She tested the manual crank on the ventilation system. She verified the emergency rations in the central storage area, the battery banks, the ham radio frequencies, the medical kit. Outside, Whispering Pines was lit up and quiet. Arden's deck was illuminated. Music came faintly from somewhere down the road. The palms that lined the development's main entrance moved in a light onshore breeze that smelled of salt and the end of summer. Velma sealed the first shutter and moved to the next one. She was not afraid. That was the part that might have surprised the neighbors if any of them had been paying attention. She had spent 2 years living inside a building designed to survive exactly what she believed was coming, and there was a particular kind of calm that came from having done the calculation honestly and built accordingly. Barnett had understood that. He had written once in the margin of a bridge project file she had found in the banker boxes after his death that the purpose of engineering was not to eliminate fear, but to give fear a precise shape, because a precise fear could be prepared for. She had a precise fear. She had prepared for it. She closed the last shutter, locked it, and stood for a moment in the sealed quiet of the dome, listening to the wind begin to change direction outside the curved walls, beginning its long and patient announcement of what was on its way. Arden Pendleton posted on the neighborhood social media page at 11:40 Thursday morning, while the first outer bands of Cillian were already darkening the western horizon into something that looked less like weather and more like a decision. He wrote that the news was doing what the news always did, which was find the most alarming possible interpretation of any situation and sell it. He wrote that their homes had been built by the best contractors in the state. He wrote that anyone who wanted to come over Thursday evening for a Stormwatch gathering was welcome, that he had a generator and a full bar, and that he was not going anywhere. 34 people liked the post. Velma read it at her monitoring station while the barometric pressure on her wall sensor ticked downward through numbers she had not seen in her 4 years on that coast. She read it once. Then she closed the browser window and went back to the atmospheric data she had been tracking for 72 hours without sleeping more than 4 at a stretch. Cillian had not turned north. The high-pressure ridge that should have deflected it had instead acted as a wall, forcing the storm due west along a path that the original forecast models had assigned a 12% probability. In the previous 48 hours, the storm had undergone rapid intensification, a process that sounded clinical, in a way that failed to communicate what it actually meant, which was that a system already capable of serious destruction had found conditions so favorable that it had essentially doubled its power, while most of the people in its path were reading reassuring social media posts and deciding whether to ride it out. Sustained winds were now at 185 miles per hour. The central pressure had dropped to 890 millibars. The storm surge projections for the Oak Haven County coastal sector had been revised upward twice in the past day and were currently sitting at 15 feet for the most exposed areas. Whispering Pines sat 4 miles inland from the primary coastline on ground that was elevated enough to escape routine tidal flooding, but not elevated enough to be outside the reach of a surge of that magnitude. Velma knew all of this. She had known the essential shape of it for 3 days. She also knew that the mandatory evacuation order for Oak Haven County had been issued at 6 that morning, which was approximately 18 hours later than she would have issued it, and that Interstate 40 and Route 17 were already reporting complete gridlock. A multi-vehicle accident on the main coastal bridge had shut down the primary inland route entirely by 9. People who had waited for official guidance before deciding to leave were now sitting in their cars on a flat coastal road with a Category 5 hurricane making landfall in approximately 9 hours. Some of them were turning around and coming back. The gathering at Arden's house that evening had a different quality than his usual deck parties. The music was lower, the conversations were shorter. People stood on the deck looking west at the sky rather than at each other. The color of the sky was wrong in a way that was difficult to describe, except to say that it was a color the sky should not be at that hour, a bruised greenish gray that seemed to press downward rather than simply exist overhead. The palms along the development entrance bent in the gusts from the outer bands, and there was a sound in the wind that had not been there in the morning, a low, consistent undertone beneath the surface noise that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the air itself. Arden stood at the railing of his deck with a drink in his hand and looked across the street at the dome. Every shutter was sealed. The solar panels were bolted flush to the exterior curve. The steel door showed no gap around its frame. The building looked exactly like what it was, a sealed concrete shell with no external features for wind to engage. Arden had looked at it this way many times over the past 2 years, and always with the particular contempt of a man whose professional identity rested on the belief that good construction meant traditional construction. But standing on his deck in that greenish light, with the undertone in the wind getting louder, he found that the contempt was harder to locate than usual. Opaline Pendleton was not at the gathering. She had told Arden she had a headache and gone upstairs. This was not true. She had been sitting at the bedroom window for an hour watching the dome across the street and trying to make a decision. She made it at 9:45. She came downstairs while Arden was on the deck with 3 other couples. Opened the back door, quietly walked around the side of the house and crossed the street. Velma answered the door before Opaline finished knocking. She had seen her coming on the exterior camera. Opaline Pendleton was a composed woman in ordinary circumstances, the kind of person who made composed look effortless because she had been practicing it for so long it had become structural. But standing at Velma's steel door in the rising wind, she looked like someone who had put the composure down somewhere and not picked it back up. Her hair was moving in the gusts, and she was not bothering to push it out of her face. She said she was afraid. Velma opened the door wider and said to come in. Opaline stepped inside. She looked around the interior with the careful attention of someone seeing a place they had imagined many times. The curved walls, the battery-powered lights, the monitoring equipment, the central storage area visible through the open doorway, the composition notebook on the side table. She said that Arden would not leave. She said that he had told her that if she believed Velma, she was admitting he had been wrong, and that she knew what that sentence meant in the context of their marriage, which was that it was not really about the storm at all. Velma looked at her steadily. Opaline asked if she should stay. Velma said she was going to answer that question honestly. She said no one in the development should stay. She said the surge projections had been revised twice, and the second revision was not the last one. She said the roads were already closed, and she understood that, but the school on the ridge 3 miles north was operating as an official shelter, and it was accessible by the service road that ran behind the development along the drainage easement, which was unpaved but passable, and which almost no one in Whispering Pines seemed to know existed because it was not on the standard maps. Then she opened a kitchen drawer and took out a folded piece of paper and handed it to Opaline. It had the GPS coordinates of the service road entrance and a hand-drawn line showing the route to the school. Opaline took the paper and looked at it. Velma said, if the water starts moving, don't wait for him. Opaline folded the paper carefully and put it in her pocket. She looked at Velma for a moment in the way that women sometimes look at each other when they have understood something that did not require being said out loud. Then she thanked her and went back across the street. Velma watched her go on the exterior camera. She watched Opaline enter the house through the back door. She watched Arden's deck where he was still standing with the same group of people now looking more directly at the sky. Then she went back to her monitoring station. By midnight, the outer bands had arrived in force. Rain that came horizontally rather than falling. Gusts that had not yet reached their full strength but were already pulling at anything with a vertical surface. The palms along the development entrance were bending at angles that revealed how deep their root systems actually went, and the answer was not deep enough. Velma moved through the dome with the systematic focus of someone executing a checklist they had memorized and revised and memorized again. She sealed the ventilation intake baffles. She moved her emergency supplies to the central core. She tested the ham radio on 3 frequencies and got clean transmission on 2 of them. She checked the battery banks and confirmed the solar panels had charged them to full capacity before the cloud cover blocked the sun. Then she sat down at her monitoring station and watched the camera feeds. At 2 in the morning, Arden's gathering broke up. She watched the guests walk to their cars and drive away. She watched the lights in Arden's house go dark one by one from the ground floor, up until only the master bedroom had a lamp burning. She looked at the ocean temperature feed, then at the pressure sensor, then at the velocity data for the eye wall, which was now 220 miles offshore and accelerating. She thought about Silas Pruitt in the rental house at the far corner of the development. She had not seen any lights in his windows for the past hour. She turned to the ham radio and broadcast on the general emergency frequency a single message. She identified her location and said that she had a sealed structure at Lot 42 Whispering Pines that could accommodate additional people if anyone in the immediate area needed shelter before landfall. She repeated the message twice. Then she switched to the CB frequency that the local contractor network used and broadcast the same thing. She got no response. She turned back to the cameras and waited. At 7:19 Friday morning, Cillian made landfall. It did not announce itself gradually. The outer bands had been building all night, and then, somewhere in the hour before dawn, the character of the wind changed from something that was growing into something that had arrived. The sustained velocity at the official Oak Haven County weather station registered 195 miles per hour before the anemometer failed. Localized gusts in exposed areas were estimated afterward at 220. Inside the dome, the noise was a continuous physical presence rather than a sound. It was a deep, low-frequency vibration that came through the floor and the walls simultaneously. The dome did exactly what Barnett had calculated it would do. The air moved over its surface the way water moves over a submerged stone, finding the path of least resistance and continuing on its way without purchase. Velma sat in her armchair with a cup of instant coffee and watched the camera feeds. The first thing she watched fail was the decorative fencing along the development's main entrance. The aluminum posts went in sequence, each one contributing its momentum to the next. Then the palms. They did not break. They were pulled out of the ground, root ball and all, and became projectiles. The second thing she watched fail was the garage door on the house 2 lots down from Arden's. It buckled inward under the pressure differential. The moment the garage volume connected to the house volume, the interior pressure dynamics changed, and she could see on the camera that covered that side of the street the way the siding on the upper story began to separate from the framing. The third thing she watched was Arden's deck. She had thought about Arden's deck specifically during the planning phase of her own construction. 50 feet of horizontal wooden planking elevated 4 feet off the ground on steel posts. It was a beautiful deck. She had seen Arden host 100 people on it over the past 2 years, and she had watched him stand at its railing, looking across at her dome with the particular contempt of a man who had decided not to examine his own assumptions. At 9:40 in the morning, with sustained winds at 205 miles per hour, the deck lifted. It did not come apart gradually. The wind found the underside at one end, and the entire structure rotated upward in a single motion, tearing the bolt connections from the concrete footings, and for a moment it was simply airborne. 50 feet of expensive hardwood turning in the gray horizontal rain before it hit the corner of Hesper Langford's house and took out her chimney stack at the base. Velma watched it happen in real time on the camera feed. She set her coffee down. She switched the camera to cover Arden's house directly. Through the blinding sheets of rain, she could see the conservatory along the back, the floor-to-ceiling glass that the architectural firm had designed as the signature feature of the home. The conservatory glass held through the first major impact, a tree branch that struck the corner frame and spiderwebbed the panel without penetrating. Then the sustained pressure against the weakened frame found the tolerance threshold, and the aluminum casing buckled. The moment the conservatory failed, the pressure inside the house equalized violently with the exterior, and Velma watched the roofline above the main structure begin to move. It rose. The hurricane straps held for approximately 4 seconds, and then the steel connectors sheared in the timber frame roof of a 6,000 square foot house, separated from its walls and went into the air above Whispering Pines. Velma did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was some form of grim validation. What she felt was the particular cold clarity of watching something you calculated happen exactly as you calculated it would, with the knowledge that being right about it meant other people were in serious trouble. She switched the camera angle looking for movement near the house. She found it in the front yard. Two figures were moving through the horizontal rain. Low to the ground, one of them helping the other. They were moving toward the street, moving toward the dome. She recognized Opalon first because of the way she was positioned slightly ahead, one arm extended back, pulling rather than being pulled. Arden was behind her, hunched, one hand pressed to the side of his head. Velma was at the door mechanism before she had finished processing what she was seeing. She engaged the gears of the winch system she had installed into the door frame during construction. She began to crank. The door resisted with the full weight of a storm that had crossed 1,000 miles of open ocean. The noise when the gap first opened was a physical pressure against her eardrums that immediately produced a ringing she would not lose for 2 days. Water came through the gap at a volume that soaked her from collar to boots in approximately 3 seconds. She put her face to the gap and yelled. Opaline heard her first. She turned and pulled Arden toward the opening. Opaline was through the gap, first scraping her arms against the steel frame, landing on the interior floor on her hands and knees. Arden came through behind her, turning his shoulders sideways, forcing himself through the narrow opening. The moment his heels cleared the frame, Velma released the winch lock and the door slammed shut with a concussive force that she felt in her back teeth. She threw the deadbolts. She spun the locking wheel. The noise dropped from something unbearable to something that was merely constant and deep. Opaline was on her hands and knees on the floor coughing. Arden was on his back. He was bleeding from a laceration above his right ear. His eyes were open and he was staring at the curved ceiling of the dome with an expression that Velma had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a man whose understanding of his situation had just changed completely. She went for the medical kit. Arden did not move while she set up the supplies. His eyes tracked around the room, the dry floor, the intact walls, the steady battery-powered lights, the monitoring equipment still running on the desk. He looked at the composition notebook on the side table. He said in a voice that was hoarser than his normal voice, "My house just exploded." Velma was cutting gauze. She said, "Sit up." He said the roof came off, and then the walls just folded. They folded like paper. She said, "Sit up, Arden. You need pressure on that cut." He sat up slowly. He looked at the notebook again. Then he looked at her. Something in his face had been removed the way a feature of the landscape gets removed when the ground shifts, and what was underneath was not something she had seen in him before. Opaline was sitting against the curved wall with her knees pulled up. She was not crying. She was looking at Velma with a directness that was different from the composure she usually projected. She reached into her pocket and took out the folded piece of paper, the GPS coordinates, and held it in her hands without unfolding it. She said, "I tried to get him to take the service road 3 hours ago." Velma looked at her. Then she looked at Arden. Arden said, "I know." Nobody said anything else for a moment. Then Arden looked at the notebook on the side table again and asked whose it was. Velma said, "My husband's." He looked at the cover, the black and white marble pattern, the wear along the spine from being opened and reopened. He said he designed this place. She said he calculated it. I built it. Arden sat with that. He looked at the walls, the ceiling, the sealed door. Outside, the noise of the storm was a physical constant that the concrete absorbed without transmitting. He said, "When?" She said, 6 years before the storm. 3 years before he died. Arden looked at the notebook one more time. Then he looked away at the wall and did not say anything else. It was Velma's monitoring station that broke the silence 20 minutes later, when the CB radio produced a burst of static and then a voice she recognized. It was flat and deliberate in the way of someone who had moved past panic into a more functional state. Silas Pruitt said his name and his location. He said his roof had been gone since 6 in the morning. He said the upper story walls had failed 40 minutes ago. He said he was on the ground floor in what remained of the structure. He was not asking for help. He was reporting. Velma picked up the handset and said, "Silas, tell me what's around you right now." He described the corner of the room he was in. Interior bearing wall to his left. Exterior wall to his right compromised but standing. Foundation slab beneath him. She said, "Stay exactly where you are. You found the right corner." A pause. Then how do you know which corner is right? She said because your house was built to code and the code requires load-bearing capacity at the intersections. The exterior walls can fail. The intersection point holds last. Another pause, longer this time. He said, you told me something like this 2 years ago. I didn't listen. She said, you're listening now. Stay in that corner. Don't move toward any exterior opening until the wind drops below 60. You'll know the difference. Static. Then understood. She set the handset down. Arden was watching her from across the room. He had a piece of gauze held against his head. The bleeding had slowed. His wife was next to him now, her shoulder against his, and he had not told her to move. He said, you've been tracking this storm for how long? She said, 72 hours since I was certain about the path. 3 years since I understood it was coming. He looked at her. He said, and you built this place because you knew. She said, I built this place because Barnett knew. I finished it. Before Arden could respond, the CO2 alarm on the wall panel fired. It was a sharp, intermittent tone, and all three of them snapped their attention to it immediately. Velma was already moving to the sensor panel. The readout showed carbon dioxide concentration rising at a rate that indicated a blocked intake. Something had struck the ventilation baffles on the exterior with enough force to crimp the intake pipe. Without intervention, the concentration would reach dangerous levels. She pulled her toolbox from the storage alcove and took out the heavy pry bar. Arden stood up. He said, where's the intake? She said, eastern exterior, 3 feet above current water level. But you have a head injury, and I'm not going to argue about this. He said, I outweigh you by 60 pounds, and I can throw more force against a pry bar. Show me where the harness is. She looked at him. He was standing steadily. The bleeding had stopped. His eyes were focused. She pulled the spare harness from the emergency supplies and showed him how to fit it. They climbed the interior ladder to the egress hatch at the apex together. She went first. When she opened the hatch, the sound returned in full, the rain hitting her face like gravel, and the wind a wall of force that she leaned into rather than stood against. She clipped her carabiner to the exterior anchor point and moved down the curved slope with her weight centered low. Arden came out behind her. The intake pipe was on the eastern face 3 feet above the flood line. Pressed against it, pinned by the current, and the wind was a section of in-ground swimming pool shell, 10 feet of white fiberglass that had been torn entirely out of someone's backyard and deposited against the dome by the surge. It sat over the intake grate like a cap. They reached it together. Velma set the pry bar under the rim of the fiberglass and found a purchase point against the concrete. She looked at Arden and held up 3 fingers. He positioned himself at the far edge of the shell, his back against it, his feet planted on the curved slope with the safety rope taking his weight. On one, they both committed. She threw her full weight against the pry bar. He drove his back into the fiberglass and pushed with everything he had. The shell shifted, scraped. Then Arden's boots slipped on the wet concrete and his safety line went slack in the wrong direction. He dropped 6 inches down the curve before the rope snapped taut, pulling him horizontal against the slope. His pry bar hand scraped the dome surface, and the tool spun away into the surge below. Velma did not think. She unclipped her own safety line from the anchor ring and threw the loose end down the slope to him. For one moment, they were sharing a single rope on a wet concrete surface in 180-mile-per-hour wind. He grabbed the line. She leaned back against the anchor point with everything she had. The current found the exposed edge of the fiberglass shell in the same instant and took it. In 3 seconds, it was gone, swept away into the gray chaos of the surge. The intake grate was clear. They scrambled back up toward the open hatch. The wind was building again as the back half of the storm began its return pass, coming now from the west. She went through the hatch. He came in behind her. She grabbed the wheel and spun it, and the bolts engaged, and the seal closed, and the noise dropped again. They sat on the steel platform of the loft with their backs against the concrete and their chests heaving. The CO2 alarm on the panel below had gone silent. Arden looked at his hands. Then he looked at Velma. He said, I sued you. She was wringing water from the hem of her shirt. She said, I know. He said, I lost. She said, I know. He said, I'm sorry. It was not the apology of a man reciting a social formula. It was the voice of someone who had spent the last 3 hours having everything he had built literally and otherwise stripped away from him, and who had just watched this woman unclip her own safety line to keep him from going into the surge, and who understood in his body what that meant, even if he had not yet finished understanding it in his mind. They climbed down from the loft. Opaline was waiting at the foot of the ladder, and she put both arms around Arden without saying anything. He held her. The backside of Hurricane Cillian hit Whispering Pines from the west. The storm was still punishing the development from its new direction when the camera feed at the top of the dome picked up a signal Velma had not expected. Through the rain and the dark, she could see a dark shape on the upper curve of the exterior, a section of debris that had lodged against the solar panel array near the apex. And clinging to that debris, barely visible in the night vision feed, was a figure. She looked at the screen for 3 full seconds before she understood what she was seeing. Hesper Langford was on the roof. She was tied to the floating debris with what looked like a length of electrical wire. Her face was a pale smear in the green night vision. Next to her, wedged under her arm, was a small dog. She was weakly striking the concrete with a piece of wood she had been using as a handhold. Velma said, "Someone is on the roof." Arden was beside her before she finished the sentence. He looked at the screen. They went up the ladder together. Velma opened the hatch against the full force of the returning storm, leaning into it while Arden held the frame. She reached out into the darkness. She could see Hesper's face turning toward the opening, her eyes wide and nearly empty of everything except the particular blank quality that came from being cold and exhausted past the point of ordinary fear. Arden climbed out onto the dome behind Velma, and together they pulled Hesper through the hatch, the small dog going first, Hesper following. The moment Hesper cleared the rim, the debris she had been clinging to snapped free from the solar array and was swept away into the dark. They slammed the hatch shut. The wheel locked. The storm resumed its argument with the exterior. Hesper lay on the steel platform of the loft. She was shivering with the deep, uncontrolled rhythm of hypothermia. The dog pressed against her side and was still. After a long moment, Hesper looked up at Velma. She said, "I circled the development in my car when the surge started. I couldn't make it back. The current took the car. I grabbed the roof section when it came past me." Velma was already moving for the thermal blankets in the storage alcove. She said, "You're here now." Hesper closed her eyes, then she opened them again and said, "Your building held." Velma wrapped the blanket around her. She said, "Yes." The backside of the storm lasted 5 hours and 13 minutes. Velma knew the precise duration because she watched the clock on her battery panel from the moment the western eyewall hit until the moment the anemometer reading on her external sensor dropped below the threshold where she trusted what it was telling her. Inside, the 4 of them had stopped trying to talk above the noise sometime around 2 in the morning and had settled into the particular silence of people who have run out of things to say and found that the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. Opaline had fallen asleep on the couch with her coat pulled over her shoulders. Arden sat against the curved wall with his knees up and his bandaged head tipped back. Hesper sat on the floor of the loft with her back against the concrete and the small dog tucked under her arm. Velma sat at her monitoring station and watched the pressure readings. She was not watching for danger anymore. She was watching because watching was what she did when she needed to keep her hands and her mind occupied, and because the storm data being generated by Cillian's passage over this particular stretch of coast was the kind of information that took years to accumulate, and she was in a position to record it. Barnett would have wanted it recorded. He had believed that the value of any event, however catastrophic, was partially in what it taught the people who survived, it provided they were paying attention. She was paying attention. At 3:40 in the morning, the CB radio produced a burst of static and then a voice. Silas Pruitt said his name. He said he was still in the corner of the ground floor. He said the exterior wall to his right had failed completely somewhere after midnight, but the interior bearing wall was still standing and the floor slab had not moved. He said, "I'm going to be okay." Velma picked up the handset. She said, "I know." A pause. Then, "How long until I can move?" She looked at the pressure reading. She said 2 hours, maybe 2.5. When the wind drops below 60 sustained, you can move toward the interior of the structure. Not before. He said, "Understood." Another pause, longer this time. He said, "I've been sitting here for about 9 hours thinking about something." She waited. He said, "I lied to you 2 years ago when I said I'd never had a roof blow off. I had one blow off in 2018. Category 2, direct hit on a house I'd lapped 3 months before. Client called me at 4 in the morning. I told him the straps must have been installed wrong by whoever did the underlayment. I told myself the same thing, but I knew the straps were mine." Velma held the handset and looked at the wall. He said, "I think I didn't want you to be right because if you were right about the building, it meant I'd been building the wrong thing for 20 years. She said, "You've been building what the codes required. The codes were built on the data that existed. The data has changed. He said you knew the data had changed. She said Barnett knew first. I learned from him. Silence on the line. Then who's going to know how to build the right way now? After this, she said people who are willing to learn. The radio went quiet. She set the handset down and looked at the pressure sensor. The reading had moved 2 millibars in the past 20 minutes. The back half of Cillian was beginning to exhaust itself. Arden was awake. She could tell by the way his breathing had changed. He was looking at the composition notebook on the side table. He had looked at it several times over the course of the night in the way that a person looks at something they want to ask about but cannot find the right moment. He asked now. He said, "Can I look at it?" Velma considered this for a moment. Then she crossed the room and handed it to him. He opened it carefully. He turned the first few pages, slowly looking at the engineering notations, the structural calculations, the margin annotations. He was not an engineer, but he had spent 22 years working with engineers and architects and contractors, and he understood enough of what he was seeing to recognize that the thinking in those pages was systematic and thorough. He turned to the page with the coordinates and the 2 sentences in the 5 words at the bottom. He read it. Then he read it again. He said he wrote this before he knew he was sick. Velma said, "I think so. The ink on the bottom line is different from the rest of the page." He came back to it. He looked at the 5 words for a long time. He said, "My father built houses. Standard frames, nothing remarkable. He built 43 houses over his career, and I watched him build maybe a dozen of them. He never talked about what he was doing while he was doing it. I asked him once when I was about 12 why he didn't explain things while he worked, and he said because if I was explaining it, I wasn't doing it." Velma looked at him. He said, "I've been in development for 22 years, and I've never built a single house with my own hands. I've directed other people to build them. I've approved designs and signed contracts and stood at deck railings. But I don't actually know how any of it works. Not the way your husband knew how this works." He closed the notebook and set it on the floor in front of him. He said, "I think I've been angry at this building since the day you submitted the plans, because looking at it made me feel like I didn't know what I was doing." Velma sat down in the chair across from him. She said, "You knew how to get your wife through the door when it mattered. That counts for something." He looked at Opaline sleeping on the couch. He said, "She got us here. I just followed her." Hesper came down from the loft, slowly holding the dog against her chest. She crossed the room and sat on the floor near Velma's chair. She said, "I need to tell you something." Velma waited. Hesper said, "The palms? The ones that appeared in your front garden 2 years ago. That was me. I paid a landscaping crew to do it overnight. I told myself it was about the neighborhood aesthetic. I told myself you had violated the spirit of the community even if you'd won the legal case." She looked at her hands. She said, "I've been telling myself things like that for a long time. About a lot of things. I'm very good at finding the framing that makes what I want to do sound like what I'm obligated to do." Velma said, "I know it was you." Hesper looked up. Velma said, "I knew within 48 hours. The landscaping crew you used had done work on your property the previous spring. I recognized their equipment marks in the soil." Hesper said, "And you didn't do anything." Velma said, "I planted the shrubs back. I had other things to focus on." Hesper looked at her with an expression that was not quite shame and not quite relief, but something that lived in the territory between them. She said, "Does it matter to you that I'm telling you now?" Velma thought about this honestly. She said, "Yes, but not because I needed the apology, because it means you spent some part of tonight thinking about something other than yourself, and given the circumstances, that seems like the right thing to have been doing." Hesper looked at the wall for a while. Then she pulled the dog closer and did not say anything else, and the silence between them was different from what it had been. The storm released its hold on Oak Haven County in stages. By 5:30 in the morning, the sustained wind reading had dropped below 100. By 6:40, it was below 60. At 7:12, Velma stood up from her monitoring station, put on her coat, and climbed the interior ladder to the apex hatch. She opened it. The sound that came in was wind still present, but of a recognizable human scale. The air smelled of salt water and torn vegetation, and a mineral rawness, the smell of ground that had been scoured to its foundation. She pulled herself up through the hatch and stood on the apex of the dome. The sun had not fully risen. The sky to the east was the particular gray that comes just before light commits itself, and what that gray light showed her was a landscape she had no prior reference for. Whispering Pines was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, gone. The development entrance with its ornamental palms and its wrought iron signage, the curving roads, the manicured lawns, the homes with their complex roof lines and their conservatories and their wraparound decks. All of it had been returned to the basic material from which it came, redistributed across a thick gray layer of storm sediment that stretched in every direction as far as she could see. The flood surge had receded back toward the ocean, leaving behind a uniform coating of fine gray silt. In the middle distance, she could see the top halves of the old oak trees that had lined the development's interior roads, their bark stripped clean by the surge, their upper branches bare and gray against the gray sky. Directly across the street were Arden Pendleton's,